Welcome everyone to this fifth virtual seminar organized by the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. My name is Thijs Pork. I'm the current president of the Society, and we're organizing these seminars to showcase all of the exciting research that's going on within our field. And today we are very honored to have as our speaker Anna Cichosz of the University of Lodz, who will be presenting a paper called Agentive Prepositions in Old and Middle English, Did Win by Chance, which is work that Anna has done with Sylwia Karasińska, who can't make it today, but will still enjoy the research that will be presented today. Now, again, we're very honored to have Anna Cichosz with us today. She is an expert in the field of English historical linguistics, with a particular interest in syntax and word formation and morphology, and not just English, but also English within with relationship to other Germanic languages, notably Old High German, as you can tell from the book on the right. The research that she is presenting today is part of a very exciting project called Variation of Syntactic and Phraseological Constructions in Old English Prose, which has also produced a number of interesting resources which are available for free in open access, or should I say, otwarty dostęp. I will share this link in the chat of the Zoom meeting, and we'll add the links in the description of the YouTube recording of this lecture. One resource is a frequency dictionary of Old English prose for learners of Old English and historical linguists, where you can find out which word is found most frequently in the Old English corpus. And another resource is a great website called VeryOE, which features a morphological dictionary and a dictionary of collocations. So if you ever want to know anything about phrases and syntax in Old English, this is the website to be. With that, and without further ado, I'm very happy to hand over the floor to Anna, and thank you again for being here, and we're very excited to learn more about agentive prepositions. So take it away.
Thank you very much for this very, very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Of course, it's always very nice to share research with other people, and the topic that I'd like to talk about today is, of course, linguistic in nature, but the conclusion that me and my co-author reached and our interpretation of what happened to agentive prepositions in early English is in fact very, very deeply rooted in the social and historical context. So I would be very, very eager to learn what you think and get your feedback. Perfect. Right. So agentive prepositions in Old and Middle English have really puzzled us. So I think, and I hope you will share our excitement that the topic is very interesting, and the development is far from obvious because, of course, today, in present-day English, we've got only one agentive preposition. So in passive structures, if the agent is present at all, because of course it's not obligatory, we've got the so-called short passive and long passive. So short passives without the by phrase and long passives with the agent expressed by means of a prepositional phrase headed by the preposition by. There are no other options. So there's just by, and this is it. But if you look at some early data, you've got huge variability. And in fact, in the earliest records of English, we've got lots of different prepositions to choose from, but there is no by. So in early English, the strongest prepositions used for this function are from, especially frequent in early Old English, as I will show you in a second. There is of, which is kind of scarce in Old English, but it's already present, and very, very frequent in Middle English, we've got durch or through, which are used both in Old and Middle English, and they are the three most frequent competitors of by. There are also some uses of mid, with, and at in this function, but those prepositions are definitely less frequent, less present in the corpus data. So so we've got examples of the three most frequent prepositions used in this function in early English here. So in 2, we've got heard from God, then in 3, we have given through the king, and then in 4, we've got baptized of the apostles, and in all of the 3 cases, we've got an agentive preposition, and they are different and they are not by. So the big question is, what happened, and how do we get from this initial variation and this great multiplicity of options to the situation we've got today, where only by is used for the function? So let me start by emphasizing that the only data that we have taken into account in this study were agentive uses. So let's think about the preposition of the agent for a second. So, of course, an agent is an entity that initiates and performs an action, which is a very nice definition, but sometimes when it comes to an actual use in a sentence, it may not be that obvious. What's crucial is volition. So the agent is supposed to act with volition, which makes it possible to differentiate agents from causes and instruments. So a prototypically agentive noun phrase should exhibit human-like or at least animate qualities, because this makes it possible for our agents to act with volition. And of course, the whole point of the passive structure is the demotion of the agent, or also cause and instrument, and the promotion of the patient. And the agent, if it is expressed in many languages, including English, this happens by means of a prepositional phrase. But the variation within the Indo-European family of languages is really huge. So to just give you a few examples, in Celtic languages represented by Irish, we've got ag, so the equivalent of at, or also o, so the equivalent of from. In Polish, it's przez, so the with the basic meaning corresponding to through. But in other Slavic languages, we've got morphological markings, so this happens through the instrumental case. In Latin, there is per or de, and as a result, different Romance languages make use of those 2 main strategies. Within the Germanic family of languages, we've got of or from, but there is no language where the cognate of by would be used for this function. So English is really exceptional. English is really interesting. And we would like to show you how it happened and why we think by finally surfaces as the basic agentive preposition used in English. So what do we know about Old English? First of all, the grammaticalization of passive constructions in Old English was still underway. So Old English does not really have a fully grammaticalized fixed passive construction, though scholars do not really agree on, first of all, the grammatical status of Old English passives and also on the criteria that could be used to assess this. But whether we call this a passive or a proto-passive, there is such a construction in Old English. It's composed periphrastically with various copular verbs, including beon, weizan, weordan, yeweordan, bekuman, weaksan, and past participles, which are usually inflected. If an agent or an instrument is introduced by a prepositional phrase, we've got options. So there are 3 agentive prepositions attested in Old English data. We've got fram, thurch, and mid. and Traugott points to from as the basic one. Mitchell also adds of to the list, and Traugott notices that the Old English preposition be, so the equivalent of by, does not appear to have been used in Old English in an agentive sense. It's rare even for the instrumental relationship, as you of course realize. Be in Old English would usually mean about, so it would rather introduce patients, not agents. So if you have a phrase be him yequevan, it does not mean said by him or say by him, but to say about him. So that's really quite a change. Right. As far as Middle English is concerned, we've got passive structures formed with the copular verb been, so to be. In early data, there are some remnants of where than, but this goes away quite fast. And of course, the past participles and agents are introduced by the preposition of in early Middle English and by in late Middle English. And existing studies also point to some agentive uses of from, through, with, and at. So one of the greatest puzzles here is why did agentive by start to rise? And we've got different theories concerning this development. So one hypothesis advocated by Fraser is that of lost its basic spatial meaning because originally basic sense of was very close to from, and gained a new meaning of determination, like in phrases the City of London. So Fraser claims that by was a logical substitute because it had a spatial meaning of transference itself. Another hypothesis is based on information structure. So it has been noted that in late Middle English, the subject position in English started to be equaled with the topic. This was not like that before. So in early English, topics could be introduced by other clause constituents. In late Middle English, the subject was the topic, became the main topic introducer. So the passive became an important discourse organizing device. And as a result of that, the number of inanimate subjects grew. And Petre notices that by is preferred with inanimate subjects of passive structures, probably because of its less clear semantics compared to the clearly spatial meaning of from and of, pointing to source, as well as through indicating path. So this rise of by is associated with this great restructuring of the passive structures in general. But it's interesting to note that Fraser links this rise of by to its specific spatial meaning, whereas Petre links it to its unclear semantics. So the interpretations here are quite different. And there is another hypothesis that by was selected because it also had a kind of instrumental meaning, as in the Old English sentence here, be his knichtum, so by his knights, by means of his knights. So we know what happened. We know that by started to rise. We know it happens at the end of the Middle English period or at the beginning of the early Modern English period. The dating differs from study to study, the exact dating, but we know that sometime between Middle and early Modern English, by starts to rise. But why? That's not clear, right? We don't really have all the answers yet, and that's why we've decided to conduct our study. So the study is corpus-based. So what we did, we made use of two annotated corpora of early English. So for the Old English data, that's the York, Toronto, Helsinki past corpus of Old English prose. And for the Middle English data, we've got the Helsinki past corpus of Middle English. So we extracted the data using the Corpus Search 2 application. So if anyone is interested in any details, we are, of course, ready to share the methodology. So the initial search was basically about extracting all clauses containing a form of the be verb, so one of the verbs, or one of the copular verbs associated with the passive structures, a past participle, and a prepositional phrase. So we checked all the prepositions indicated in the literature as the ones that could perform this function. But of course, even though we've got syntactically annotated corpora, which make our job much easier, still there was quite a lot of manual work involved because, of course, the queries returned all sorts of stuff. So all passive structures with a prepositional phrase. And of course, most of those prepositional phrases did not, in fact, introduce agents. So we had to manually annotate every clause as containing an animate or personal agent, as in 5. So Framgode Juhuret clearly contains an animate a noun in the prepositional phrase. So we annotated this as an example of an agentive use. But lots of the clauses that we got resembled 6. So we've got a logical subject performing another semantic role. So it's force, instrument, source. So for example, in 6, someone is protected through God's liefde, so through God's grace. And it's quite clear that grace is not the agent here. So the God's graces are rather the instruments of God. So God is the real agent behind the action here. So we excluded cases like 6. We were interested in clearly agentive uses. And of course, we also did get a lot of syntactic noise. For instance, in number 7, something was made of wood, which is, of course, not a structure we were interested in. So we extracted all the clauses, then we annotated them manually, and then we got the results that I would like to share with you. So for Old English, what do we have in the data? So the table shows quite clearly, I hope, that the basic preposition that was used in the data here is pram, which basically corresponds to what Traugott indicated in her study. So when you look at numbers, then fram is clearly the basic Old English agentive preposition. But the result for sturh is also quite robust. We also got 40 clauses with mid introducing an agent and only 9 with om. But we did find all the prepositions indicated in the literature as potential agent introducers. So we've got in 8 baptized from Paulina, so from. In 9 we've got through goddess angel, so through God's angel. In 10 mit him, meaning by him. Taught, and in 11 of sumum mannum ienemnet, so called of some people, by some people. And so we've got 823 clauses we were interested in altogether. And then we started looking at those clauses, and one of the first things we did was to take a look at textual distribution. I know this slide may look very complex and not very clear, but let me just walk you through it. So this is the situation in individual texts with at least 10 instances of the structure we were interested in. So from the most numerous at the bottom to the least numerous at the top. And blue stands for agentive from, orange for agentive durch, gray for mid, and is yellow for of. So mid and of are really not that important here, but if you look at the proportions between blue and orange, you can see that it really depends on the text. So there are texts which clearly prefer from. So, for instance, Gregory's dialogues, so the text you can see at the very bottom. But there are also texts where orange dominates. And when you look at those texts, it very clearly transpires that most of the clauses where through is the dominant agentive prepositions were composed by Alfred. So the only two exceptions are cura pastoralis, and I will get back to this in a second because there is also an explanation for it, and homilies by Wulfstan, but for Wulfstan we only get 13 clauses altogether, so the closer you get to the top of this graph, the less reliable the results are. But there is clearly a difference between Alfred and the rest, and this is important because Alfred is the author of 25% of all the prose records of Old English. So if you take the Wyco corpus, 25% of the Wyco corpus are texts by Alfred. So when Alfred does something, the qualitative results always show it, but that's Alfred. So is it Old English in general, or is it just Alfred's preference? So that's one of the questions. So what we did next was we tried to identify any diachronic trend. That's not very impressive for Old English, but in a moment we will combine this with the results for Middle English, and then it will become much more meaningful. So if you just divide the results into early and late Old English, you get the impression that from, well, starts up as the basic preposition, but then it goes down quite drastically, but through seems to be on the rise. But let's remember that this late Old English through, that's mostly Alfred. So this individual preference by Alfred to a great extent influences the data we've got. Okay. So where am I? I'm here. Okay, sorry. So the next thing that we did was to take a look at collocations. So we started to wonder to what extent the use of a given preposition depended on the particular lexical verb used in the structure. So there is no mid and there is no of in the table because they were too infrequent for any meaningful conclusions to be drawn, but we've got the data for pram and sur here. And if you look at this, it turns out that through is predominantly used with one lexical verb, yequevam, so to speak. And if you look at dispersion, it also turns out that what you've got is to a great extent limited to textually limited. So here you've got 4 texts, but we've got most of those results from one text, cura pastoralis, where you've got the phrase said through someone, said through someone, said through someone used regularly. So it seems that this particular phrase really inflates the frequency of the structure in this particular text. And what's interesting is that it's all in the same context when something is said through a prophet. So is the prophet really, I mean, that's the person who does the talking, but is the prophet saying it, or is it God saying this through the prophet? So it seems to introduce an intermediary rather than the real agent behind the action. So what happens in cura pastoralis, so that's not what Elfrich does. So Elfrich uses through with all sorts of verbs, but the high result for cura pastoralis is related to this particular phrase, and we also looked at the Latin source text for cura pastoralis, and it's clearly based on Latin, where we get lots and lots of per someone dicitur, per someone queritur. So that's definitely not a reliable result, but you have to dig in to realize that. With from, there is more variation. So there is also one basic verb which inflates the frequency of the structure, and this is sendan or ascendan, where actually the prepositional phrase is ambiguous between source and agent. So if someone or something is sent from someone, like from minum fader, I was sent by my father, or I was sent from my father, or it was kind of both at the same time. So it's true that in some of those sentences, you could argue that's not really the agent, but anytime we got an animate entity, we annotated this as an agent if it was possible to annotate it as an agent. And the results for from are not all like this. So in most cases, the agentive use is quite clear, though sent from someone, again, quite clearly corresponds with another Latin phrase we get in the Vulgate Bible, for instance, so missus adeo. So Mitchell noticed that there is a visible impact on Latin source texts on the use of those agentive prepositions, in particular translations into Old English. So it's absolutely confirmed, and we absolutely agree. And it also points to this lack of fixedness of the structure, right? So the structure is not really fixed yet. There is a lot. So there is room for different choices, and the choices are to some extent lexically based. Okay, so to sum up the situation in Old English, we would say that the agentive prepositional phrase construction in this period was at a very early stage of development. So we see little stability, high compositionality. So it really depends. So the meaning of the particular preposition is important for the choice. So the combination of the preposition of the lexical verb to a great extent influences the choice. There is also sensitivity to foreign influence, and also the question of individual preference in the case of Elfrich. And out of all the lexemes used in this function, from seems to be the only one which may have been on its way to constructionalize as the future agentive preposition, though the trend is not fully clear if you just look at the numbers, mostly because of Elfrich's preference for the competing preposition sturch, and also because of those formulas used, for instance, in cura pastoralis. So if you look at the Old English data alone, and if someone asked you to foresee the future, so which preposition would be picked to become the default agentive preposition in English? Well, I would bet my money on from, based on the data I've just seen. And I would lose, because here comes Middle English, and suddenly everything gets different, like everything. So if you just count all the instances, it turns out that this time the winner is of. So the preposition which was hardly attested in Old English, there were some single instances, and now of is really frequent. So 42% of all the results have of as the basic preposition, as in 14. So crowned of Gregory V. And then we get the newcomer, then by shows up on the scene, and it shows up in style because it's already 36% of the data we've got. Through is still quite robust, I would say, so 20% of all the data we've got, but from is practically absent, right? Just 11 clauses in the whole corpus. And we've got 3 clauses with mid, so but mid was quite weak to start with. So what happened? What's going on here, right? The change is just amazing. So we did the same thing as with Old English. We looked at individual texts. And if you look at individual texts, I'd like to draw your attention to the purple, so to through. So we've got it, but we've got it in 2 texts only, 2 long texts only. I'm only showing you the longest text, right, from the corpora, of course. And there is 1 text which only relies on through for this function, and that's the ormalum. So that's the text you've got here at the bottom. And there is also 1 other text where through is attested, but it's totally absent from all the others. So again, if you just look at numbers and if you just lump it together, then you can't see what's going on. But if you look at individual texts, the differences are really quite drastic. And another thing that I would like to emphasize is that the proportions between orange and reddish here, or yellow and dark orange, so of and by, this depends on the sub-period to a great extent. So all the texts in which by is dominant are marked as M4, so they are the latest texts, right? So something definitely happens before this last Middle English sub-period. So again, we've got a lot of variability, but this time based on a new set of prepositions. So again, if we look at lexical or collocations or lexical tendencies, well, through is kind of suspicious to start with, because it's just, well, it's practically only the ormalum, and then in the ormalum, it's mostly 1 verb. So setten, to set, and you've got 17 as a representative example of the context of the formula in which this is used. So a given commandment was set by God, and this was set by God, and set by God, and set by God, and as a result you get this structure in the corpus quite well represented. But if you just filter it out, it turns out it's not that important at all. Now, the interesting thing with by, on the other hand, is that it's predominantly used with semantically broad verbs, right? So the 3 most frequent collocations are make, take, and do. So what could be more general than that? With of, it is more lexically fixed, so you've got more specific, narrower verbs. So to slay, to crown. There is also make, but many of the uses are also lexically fixed. So I would say that by is definitely most diverse in its collocational range. So we already know that by showed up. It showed up quite late, but it showed up and it was already quite broad in its scope. Okay, so let's look at the diachronic trends. So that's just all over the place, right? So through is very frequent at the beginning, and then we've got this extremely sudden drop, and that's the end of it. Then, well, from is very infrequent to start with, and it never really rises again. The same situation with mid. Of, on the other hand, it's on the rise. So between M1 and M3, it goes up, and then suddenly it drops. And by is the only one which develops nicely. So from a relatively low frequency at the very beginning. So it's absent from M1. There is no by in M1. There is a bit of it in M2, and then it's rising and rising, right, very consistently. So that's the diachronic trend. Now, another thing that I would like to say now is that even though we focused on agentive uses, it doesn't mean that we didn't look at other contexts. And what we noticed was that in M3 and M4, we actually get lots of phrases by the something of someone, so by the order of the king, or by the hands of the bishop, as in 18. So by is perhaps not most frequent in M3 when it comes to introducing animate agents, but it's very well attested in such phrases. And among all the noun phrases that qualify both as agents and other logical subjects, there are only 33 double-off phrases, as in 19, and 194 by something of someone phrases. So our impression was that perhaps it's the stylistic clumsiness of the something of someone compared to by the something of someone, which actually gives by a stylistic advantage. So, and I think it's more than just stylistics. I'll get back to this in a second, but of started to do lots of different things in Middle English. It became this basic functional preposition, so of genitive to start with, and many other contexts. So our impression was that this multifunctionality of the preposition of in Middle English could have led to its growing dispreference in passive contexts, and somehow paved the way for the success of this more specialized preposition be in the centuries to follow. So to just combine all the data and get to the interpretation, if we combine the diachronic trends for Old English and Middle English, that's what I would call huge variation, right? So when we first looked at this graph, we were like, okay, what do we do with this? Because the variation is absolutely amazing. But if you look at individual factors, and if you look at individual texts, and if you look at lexical preferences, suddenly things are getting clearer, I think. So I would say that there are a few sub-stories to this story. So the first thing that we have to analyze and interpret is this rise and fall of the preposition from or from, which seemed to be on its way to becoming the basic English agency preposition. It's possible it was modeled on the Latin a, but no matter where it comes from, it was strongly attracted to the construction. It was quite consistently and unambiguously applied for introducing animate agents in the Old English passive. And its main competitor, so surh, was more limited in scope, and its regular use by Elfrich and Orm. And Orm is called a follower of Elfrich. He knew his works. It's possible that the use of through in the Ormalum is somehow modeled on what Elfrich did. And then we also have some lexically fixed Latin-based formulas that inflate its frequency. The basic meaning of surh also implies this intermediary rather than a direct agent. So through, I don't think it was ever a serious candidate for this general English agentive preposition, but from definitely was. Then another puzzle is the rise of, and then the fall of, and the rise of by. So the rise of it's practically absent from the Old English data, as you could see, climbs up the graph between M1 and M3, then loses ground in M4, giving way to by. And just like the general increase in the use of after the Norman conquest, it's often claimed to have been modeled on the French de. But there is an alternative view. It's also, in some studies, it's treated as an influence of Old Norse. So phrases says the Old Norse preposition av might well have encouraged the use of the related Old English preposition of as a rival to from in the expression of agency. So that's not fully clear where it really comes from. But what we see is a puzzle. So there is no continuation between the Old English from and the early Middle English of. So there is a complete reverse of the trends. And what we think may have happened is related to the textual situation in early Middle English. So passive is used in formal writing much more often than in speech. And it's plausible to assume that the tendency was similar in all the stages of English. Now, the social and political situation in England after the conquest, of course, meant that early Middle English was rarely recorded in writing. We've got the famous M1 problem, so few texts from the beginnings of the Middle English, M1 and M2 problem from the Middle English period. So the question is, if the agency preposition could not have been redundant for the great majority of language users. So if you just sum up all the agentive prepositions in individual subperiods, so it doesn't really matter what preposition is used, but how often the long passive is used, so passive with an agent expressed, you can see that there is a clear drop at the beginning of the Middle English period. So the long passive was not used by the speakers. It doesn't really matter what prepositions they would prefer. The construction as such became very infrequent. So to give you some numbers, in present-day English, passives are most common in academic prose, and in conversations, they account for only 2% of all finite verbs. There is a study by Sylwia which shows that in more formal, informative Middle English, early modern English texts, such as law, science, sermons, there are more passives in general, and the passives are more frequently long, so with a by phrase or an off phrase. While in less formal, imaginative texts like private letters, drama, fiction, passives are less common, and if they are present, they are predominantly short. So it's not just something that happens in present-day English. Generally, throughout the history of English, and probably not just English, passives, and especially long passives, so with an expressed agent, are used in formal writing, predominantly in formal writing. Now, of course, in Old English, literacy is not high, to to put it mildly. So we've got few literate lay individuals, and Wormland calls the situation a clerical monopoly. And the situation doesn't really change drastically throughout the Middle English period. So I looked for some numbers, and Fox says that at the beginning of the 16th century, an aggregate of perhaps 5% of adult males and 1% of adult females could sign their names in England. So most people were, of course, illiterate. So any kind of change would only be transmitted through spoken language. In M3, English authors who tried to render passive structures they came across, for instance, in Latin or in French texts, couldn't really find inspiration for the English form in earlier native texts because Old English was no longer accessible to them. So, yes, at the end of the Old English period, pram was on its way to become the basic agentive preposition, but perhaps the lack of continuation we see between late Old English and then late Middle English is the result of this gap. So there was no transfer really, right? It stopped for a while. So M3 authors just had to come up with something new. So the process just had to start once again. So yeah, we've got the structure in Old English, but it doesn't matter because then we've got this gap, and then you just have to start from scratch. So to us, this is the explanation for this puzzling lack of continuity between the Old English fram and Middle English of. Then another piece of this story, so the fall of and the rise of by. So in M4, of definitely loses its leading position, not just in terms of simple token frequency. So this is what our numbers show. There are some studies that date this change of trend to some later periods. Fraser links the weakening position of in the agency prepositional phrase construction to the semantic change, right? So it's no longer spatial. It becomes a functional preposition devoid of spatial meaning. But if of had undergone a full constructionalization process before this semantic change, the change itself wouldn't have influenced the situation. no other option of expressing agentivity would have been available. So if of made it, so if of became fixed as the basic English agentive preposition before its semantic change, then it would stay as the basic agentive preposition in English. No, I mean the change in the basic semantics of the preposition wouldn't have influenced the situation really. So this means that of had not managed to achieve this stage by the end of M3. So it was still not fixed. And we firmly believe that this parallel development of the of genitive construction must have had an impact on the process. So there are studies that show that the of genitive grows from around 6% of all genitive constructions at the beginning of the 13th century to 85% at the beginning of the 15th century. This is huge. So of was becoming increasingly frequent and increasingly versatile in Middle English, and perhaps it's just too frequent and too versatile for all those functions to be retained. It was just doing too much at the same time. So by appears quite late, but its development is steady, it's consistent. The corpus frequency grows with time. It shows growing collocational range, so more and more verbs are attracted to it. The use is well balanced. It's not limited by lexically fixed formulas. So it's a good option. It's a really good option. But of course, it wouldn't have been chosen if everything was okay with of, which started in Middle English as the basic agency preposition. So why by? So Petre points to this ability of by to combine with inanimate subjects of passive constructions. There are studies which suggest another foreign influence, but no matter where it really comes from, the point is that this multifunctionality of led to its accumulation in so many grammatical contexts that it produced a demand for an alternative. So Rodenburg introduces the term horror equi, so the fear of similar, right? So the tendency to avoid adjacency of identical grammatical structures in the same context. So you've got an example of this in 20. So then Colmanus, the bishop of Northumbria, was found guilty of neglecting Easter by Wilfrid. So if of was used here, we would have 4 different of phrases within the same sentence. So this really, I think this is just too much. So there was clearly a demand for something different. And by was the only preposition which made it to this point, which was there in the system. It was ready to be picked because through was never seriously taken into account. From was abandoned because of this lack of continuation between Old and Middle English. So by took over, we think, not because it was particularly well suited for the function, but it was just the only alternative available in the right place at the right time. There was nothing else that M4 authors could refer to in this context. So, to conclude, and I hope I'm on time, more or less, what our study shows, we hope, is the break in the constructionalization process after the Norman conquest, which explains this puzzling lack of continuity between Old and Middle English. It also shows how individual preferences can blur the picture. So token frequency, something that a corpus linguist would usually take as a departure point, so as a starting point for investigation, it's just a starting point. You have to dig deeper to see what's going on, because then you can't really understand the change, I think. The changes can't be analyzed in isolation from other Middle English linguistic phenomena, and most importantly, the rise of the multifunctional preposition of. And also, we think that this particular development here is related to the fact that the long passive or agency prepositions are a structure which is restricted to formal writing. So it's not well entrenched in individuals from predominantly illiterate communities. So there is, so it's natural that because of such limited transmission, the conventionalization process is slowed down, it's much more tricky. So if there is no or little support from the spoken language, the process has to be more difficult. So all this must have contributed to those peculiarities of the process. And we don't think it's an accident that by gets fully conventionalized in the 16th, 17th century, when literacy started to grow in the early modern English period. So this final establishment of agentive by took place after we had the critical number of speakers necessary for the process to be completed. So I don't think the timing is random. I think the timing is really very logical here. These are the references, and this is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can all agree that this was an excellent paper by Anna Cichosz and great research by Anna and Sylwia. Thank you very much indeed. I think, Fatima, we can stop the recording here and then we can go on to the Q&A. I'm sure that people have been inspired